So I have a dissociative disorder. Yes, as in multiple personalities, even though that is not what we call it anymore. And today I want to talk about why I think I have a dissociative disorder, because I honestly believe that my autism and ADHD are a big part of the reason. Hi, hello, my name is Megan, and I am an autistic and ADHD content creator and life coach for other auDHD adults like myself. But today I want to talk about one of my other diagnoses, which is OSDD, which stands for Other Specified Dissociative Disorder. So real quick, let's just talk about what OSDD is. I have a whole other video about that over here if you want more in-depth information, but just to give you like the quick and dirty of it, OSDD is a dissociative disorder in which it can present in lots of different ways actually, but for me, I have semi-distinct selves that all live in my brain. It is in the same family as DID, which is dissociative identity disorder, which used to be known as multiple personality disorder, but there are definitely some key differences between OSDD and DID. For me, one of the biggest differences is that I don't have total amnesia between all of those parts. I don't black out, I don't lose chunks of time. Generally speaking, my parts share our memories with each other. However, those parts, what makes OSDD, my experience, different than someone who might be doing parts work or, just acts a little different in different contexts, the thing that's different is that those parts of me are distinct enough. Like, we're not so distinct that we don't share memories, but we are distinct enough from each other that we're kind of separate identities. For example, I experience a lot of emotional amnesia. So I might know that a different part experienced an emotion, but when a new part is fronting, that part really doesn't remember how that felt or why we felt that way. It feels so disconnected. Something that I am working on is communicating with all of my parts a little better. And to do that, I actually made a system check-in form/spreadsheet. This is possible in Xtiles, which is a organizational software I've talked about before. I really love them. This is not sponsored by Xtiles, but I did make this form/spreadsheet. It basically, you fill out the form, you do a check-in, how are you feeling today? Which part are you? What's the date? All of that stuff. And then it'll auto-fill a spreadsheet for you. It's really helpful. So if you want that, it's totally free. You can get it in the description. Okay, so now that we know what OSDD is, I think we need to talk about how I believe my OSDD is connected to my autism and my ADHD. Dissociative disorders are generally believed to, most of the time, be caused by trauma. There's a lot of debate in the world of dissociative disorders, whether they're always caused by trauma or whether they can be what's called endogenic, meaning you can be plural and have multiple identities without having had trauma. Some people say those people do have trauma, they've just repressed it. Other people say no, there seems to be a genetic component to plurality, and therefore it should be possible to be plural without trauma. There's a lot of debate, and I am not here to settle that debate. Heaven knows I do not know enough to say anything definitively, but a lot of people who have dissociative disorders have a history of trauma. The idea is that the trauma was so difficult for that person to cope with that their identity, their consciousness split off, so that part of them wouldn't have to experience the trauma and this other part could handle it for them. And this split can happen again and again. I mean, some systems are relatively small with maybe 2 or 3 parts, and some systems are very robust with maybe even hundreds of parts. For me, I think my system falls somewhere in the middle. I have identified about a dozen parts. I suspect there might be more, but I'm not totally sure. I haven't done a super in-depth system map yet. But yeah, when you experience trauma, part of your brain takes over to handle it, and the other part retreats in order to be safe. And to be honest, I have never experienced something that people would consider severe enough for the brain to literally split itself. I've never been assaulted, I've never been in military combat, I didn't go through abuse, and so part of me, and probably some of you might be thinking, why do you have a dissociative disorder then? And I think the answer might be related to autism and ADHD. I did not receive my autism and ADHD diagnoses until I was 27 years old. And not only did I go undiagnosed for a lot of my life, I also went undersupported, misdiagnosed, and misunderstood. I mean, think about it. What if you took a key part of your identity, like your neurotype, and instead of having it welcomed and embraced and celebrated, it was treated like a personal failing your entire life, starting at a very young age? Wouldn't that be traumatic? I had a past therapist who I am endlessly grateful for, because she was the one who showed me that being gaslighted and misunderstood for decades is not a small trauma. That is a big fucking deal. I was never mirrored. Not because my loved ones were jerks, but because I was different from them in ways that they did not understand or have the language or tools to help me with. No one ever told me that I made sense. I grew up feeling so utterly wrong all of the time. And while my family loved me and loves me so much and so well, they didn't get me. And I know that sounds like such a whiny first world problem, but not being understood, not being mirrored, not being attuned to and met where you're at is traumatic. And I think this happens to undiagnosed and undersupported ADHDers more often. And P.S., the reason I keep saying undiagnosed and undersupported is because some people went undiagnosed, but their quirks and disability was always embraced and supported. And vice versa, some people were diagnosed very early and were still treated like they were the problem. So what causes this trauma is not the lack of a diagnosis, it's the lack of adequate support. So let's go over some examples of what this lack of support can look like that could lead to a dissociative disorder. For ADHD, there's my forgetfulness, which was always interpreted as, well, you just don't care about it enough. If you cared, you couldn't possibly forget, which of course we know with ADHD is not true at all. There was my impulsivity, which was often seen as, being attention seeking, or as I was often told, having no common sense. And then there was my inattentiveness and my tendency to daydream, which actually was an early indication of dissociation for me. And that was always interpreted as being very self-absorbed, self-obsessed. Like, the fact that I thought deeply about myself was a bad thing. And as for my experience with autism, I had a lot of sensory sensitivities that I was basically told just I didn't have. I was making them up for reasons unknown. Then there's my bottom-up thinking, which is a pattern of thinking that a lot of autistic people experience, where we go on like a fact-finding mission and we gather all the facts first. Then we come up with possible conclusions, and then we kind of go through and we decide which one is the most likely. And if you're autistic and you're watching this, you're like, yeah, that's how everyone thinks all the time. No. A lot of people have top-down processing, which is where they take their gut reaction and then they look for evidence and they try to see if it makes sense. And by the way, bottom up, top down, neither one is better or worse than the other. They both have their flaws, they both have their strengths. But in our society, top-down processing is often prioritized and praised more often than bottom-up, which can be a lot slower. I was often accused of overthinking things, when in reality, I was just thinking differently. And finally, we have my emotional sensitivity, which often got me labeled as dramatic or a crybaby or exaggerating. As a result of all of these value judgments being placed on my neurotype, something I could not control, especially that last one about the emotional sensitivity, I think my brain decided to cordon off my emotional experiences into completely separate parts, so that that dismissal and invalidation and gaslighting could also be cordoned off and not kind of infect the whole system of who I was. So for example, I have a depression part. And I have a part who is dedicated to holding my obsessive tendencies. And I have a part who is kind of a manager who is often irritable because they want to go feel feelings, but they have to take care of daily living. And because these bad emotions are off on their own parts, when I'm not currently feeling them, it's really hard for me to imagine that I ever did. It just feels fake to me. And then when I am in those parts, it feels like all I've ever felt is depression, for example. Because for that part, that's true. that part's job is to hold the depression. And so all that part has ever experienced is depression. So it's not the same as like when a depressed person, starts seeing everything through the depressed lens of like, I was probably depressed back then, I'll probably be depressed forever. Like depression can make us very myopic in that way, but it's not quite the same as that, because for that part, it's true. That part has only ever been depressed because that is their job. For a while when I got diagnosed with OSDD, I thought maybe I had some big, secret, hidden, repressed trauma that caused the OSDD. And if I'm being honest, there's still a part of me that worries about that. But I'm starting to realize that the trauma of going under-supported with autism and ADHD for several decades could absolutely be enough or bad enough or whatever to cause a dissociative disorder. Now, to be clear, I am not saying that every ADHDer also has a dissociative disorder. Not at all. And I'm also not trying to diminish the immense and horrible trauma that so many people with dissociative disorders have been through. I'm just trying to say that having a key part of your identity go dismissed for most of your life is bad enough to potentially lead to a dissociative disorder. And it's important to me to honor that it was bad enough and it did count. And I hope by sharing my experience, I've helped you feel like your experiences are valid as well. If you're watching and you're also a system looking to improve your system communication, be sure to download the X-Tiles system check-in template below, and I will see you all next week.